Hello friends, I had a question about how to finish a handkerchief, so I thought I'd take my finished color wheel and give it a nice edging. This is one style of doing it with a simple open work border. That's one of my favorite ways. If you like it, would recommend having a look at different types of open work and drawn work. It's very pleasing, requires just a little bit of setup, and goes a lot faster than you might expect. So I've already got this started and have done two sides. So now I'm going to finish up the next two sides. For this, you can just draw your threads ahead of time. I like to not, just in case I change my mind on anything. And also, I prefer to not draw out my threads completely and instead leave the edges. So what we're going to do here is pick one of these threads that I've already drawn from my corners. If you were starting this out, you'd decide how far away from your edge you want to draw, pick a thread and start pulling. For this, you will need the distance to be enough to fold once, twice, a third time, more or less. We'll see that when we fold. So because this fabric isn't entirely square as far as the weave, then I have drawn, I think, 10 threads one direction versus 8 threads another, so that I end up with a more or less even corner. Honestly, it's not required. I just happen to like to have something a little bit more even. So I'm going to pick one of these and pull. And it is very likely that I'm going to break my thread, and that's okay. I'm just pulling so that I can see where it pulls from, and the more that you draw, the easier it gets. So again, bit of a break there, that's fine. The first few are going to be really tricky. After that, it gets a lot easier. It's also easier if you're pulling short distances. If you're working with something like linen, you may find that you end up with a lot of fluffs. This is cotton, so it's pretty strong, and I have a relatively easy time. If you're not entirely certain, like I can see pretty well which of these threads is the thread that I'm pulling. If you're not certain about it, just do it in smaller bits. And taking your time never hurt anyone. The other thing you can do, of course, is draw until it breaks, and then it's really easy to find. If you draw the wrong thread and you realize partway through, oh, I've pulled the wrong thread, then you can always just fuss it back. And that requires just a little bit of fussing. I had to do that on one of my corners before, so it's never too late to fix it, but I don't mind. There we are. Taking a little time. So, how about I skip ahead? Oh, the other thing is, normally I would have to decide when I get to the end and then come up this way, but because this is my last corner that I'm setting up, I can also pull from this side, and then I'll match them up when I get down to the corner. So why not pull one from here as well? This guy. I find it easier to grab my edges because then I know for certain where I am in the pattern. For some people, it's easier to grab the middle because then if you missed which thread you were grabbing and picked one on either side, then you are still grabbing one of the threads that you would have pulled. So there isn't really a wrong answer here. Come join me. All right, so I found my corner, mostly. And now what I need is very sharp scissors, because maybe once I pick up a little bit more of this sharp corner, that's a bit better. Okay. I don't remember offhand which side I've drawn 8 threads and which side I've drawn 10 threads. So let's just start by snipping 4 threads on each side. I'm going to need to see a little bit better here. And I'm going to snip down this drawn thread. There's 2. And I've got 3 more there. And again, on this side, let's work away from myself. 1, 2, 3. That's 4 or 5. I know that I will end up taking more, so it's okay for now. So I should be able to draw these next ones an awful lot easier because there's less friction pressing against them, right? So grab the next one in the series and pull, just like drawing up a gather, and I can pull out the thread completely. So that was 2. I actually don't need to count these because I've already cut both sides, but that's okay. 3. 4. Now I don't happen to remember. I have one more that I can grab here. There's my 5th one. So I haven't cut the other ones yet. And it looks like I have 3 more there. Well, let me just cut 1. Can always cut more threads. Can't exactly put them back. Although, you can always cover a great deal. If someone doesn't want to be drawn, we'll worry about that later. Whereas on this side, I've cut the first few, so I can draw here as well. So you'll notice that the first one doesn't always want to go easy. There's still quite a bit of friction there. Okay, we've drawn our threads. Again, we could have done all of this at the start, but I tend to work mine as I go. I forgot to mention the very important part at the start is as well to clean up our edges because we're going to be turning a fairly small hem, so you don't want too much fluff coming up on the inside of those. Next section is we're going to turn the hem under. So again, I want to have a nice rolled edge here. Try not to catch too much cat hair in it, and then fold again up to that line of drawn thread. I like to use a pin for this to hold it in place. You can also just finger press it. If you aren't wearing any kind of lipstick or chapstick, you could also use your lips to press it. Although I don't recommend doing that in public in, these times. When we get to corners, you have to be a little bit careful about folding the edges over nicely, but I'm going to whip stitch those closed and that will cover a multitude of sins. So just going to grab another pin, not one of my nice ones, but that'll do. Rethread my needle here. When I'm just doing the open work part of it, I don't mind. I like using a blunt needle, but for sections like this, it's actually way easier to use something with a sharper point. So this is just where you happen to come in. What I'm going to do is come up here and whip stitch my edges shut. Doesn't have to be very pretty, because so long as those edges meet, they'll hold. No one's really going to be looking at my white on white edge stitches. They'll be far too impressed with my drawn work hem. So again, that's just to hold those in place. I can ditch that needle for now, or that pin. And I would really like if this end of thread will last me long enough to wrap. Okay, so here we have our rough edge. You can see how this one thread really wants to escape. We're not going to let it. So I am just going to again whip stitch the border. If you wanted to, you could do a blanket stitch, but honestly, for something little like this, it's not necessary. I'm making sure to catch underneath on the back side of that hem, as well as the first few threads of the top. And I think I'd rather have a nice new long thread to start my edge stitching. So, yes, miss. I'll grab a new thread, tie this one off, and actually, don't even need to tie it off. Disappear it within the hem. I can cut it off. Let me grab a new thread. All right, I have threaded a new needle. So what I'm going to do is go under, for me on this project, roughly 6 threads. Now you can count them if you want, but you don't need to. You can also just eyeball it, honestly, at this gauge. So I've gone under those 6 threads. I'm going to pull a little bit back towards the direction I've come from, and I'm going to go under them again, but this time I'm also going to go through the back side and the front side. So once I do a couple of these, I'll turn this over and you can see it. I'm holding what I'm referring to as the back side. That's this edge that I'm going to stitch to the front. Holding that nicely tight, and I'm going to go under my roughly 6 threads in just a moment. There we are. Get that lined up. Again, you can count these or you can eyeball them. With small threads, it doesn't matter too much with larger threads you might notice. So grab these, and I'm feeling for that. Maybe I shouldn't have switched to the blunt needle. Maybe I'll switch back to the sharp one. Under, kind of tension them back a little bit. So here I'm going through those layers, 1 or 2 threads back from the edge. Now, I'm going to turn this over so you can see I'm catching the back layer and then going through the front, pulling this relatively tight, but I don't want to pull what I've already done because I want to be able to have a flat line here. So I will keep stitching and I'll let you know how it goes when I get to the next corner. All right, and we're back. Finished the third side. Time to do up the fourth. I've finished this corner by whip stitching it shut and then whip stitching along my open edge there. So again, this is my side where the threads are a little bit narrower, so I'm not necessarily counting to 6. But again, if you are working with an even weave, if you've counted your threads, if your threads are a little bit bigger, you may want to count them. Or even if you're just not quite certain yet how big these are, in the same way as before you've done a whole bunch of stitches, maybe you want to count your threads to make sure that your stitches are the same size. That's okay. But you don't have to if you don't want to, because especially when it's this little, no one will notice if one is a little bigger than the other. And on non-even weave fabrics, so where they didn't take extra time to make sure that all the threads were the same, the threads aren't the same. So even if you counted them, they still might not be the same size. So just kind of go with it, see what feels right. But again, just to review, I'm going underneath roughly 6 threads, so catching them on my needle, pulling back just a little bit, and then not catching any of my previous stitches because I've done that before. Going under those stitches again, but this time through the bottom. And so what that's doing is it's stitching my hem closed in a way that actually makes it sometimes difficult to see which is the right side and which is the wrong side because of the open work detail here. So that can be really nice if you want something that is sort of good on both sides. Why don't you join me at the end of this? All right, so I have finished all 4 sides, including whip stitching my corners. Let's have a closer look at this. So it's just gathered on the bottom edge, and that's 2 wraps around. The second one is the one that stitches the edge together. And then in the corners, whip stitching around to cover the cut stitches, the cut edges, and then as well whip stitching to the grounding layer so that it stays nice and tidy. On the back side, it doesn't look demonstrably different from the front. So this is really nice when you want to have an edge that you can't necessarily tell the front from the back. I'll go give this a good hand wash to get rid of the dirt marks from my hands as I was working it, and then I'll give it a good press. That's what you should always do at the end of your embroidery if you get the chance. But first, let's have a look at one other style of finishing. So for our next example, we're going to give a rolled hem to the edge of this fabric that also makes a nice hem on a handkerchief. I'm going to try to do what I can. I've got a determined very lap cat here. So I've secured my thread in the body of my fabric, and I'm going to very gently fold over the narrowest possible fold of fabric here. and I'll take a little stitch up in it. I want to note that I'm starting a little bit away from my corner. I'm not going to bother turning the corner on this piece because it's just a practice, but when I'm working a corner into a handkerchief or a scarf, I prefer to not start and finish at a corner because it can be a really bit fussy. Also, sometimes it happens that the thread wants to tie itself into a knot pretty much on the first stitch, and when that happens, just open the knot up with your needle, carry on with your day. Alright, so I've just gone through, taken a little tiny stitch up there. I'm going to go back down, take a little tiny stitch here, just underneath the raw edge folded over there. It's going to be a little bit fussy at the edge because the threads are going to want to catch that corner. So for my first few, I'm going to have to fuss a lot. And I'm not going to pull this tight yet because I want to see what I'm doing. So again, tiny stitch up there, and again, tiny stitch down here. I'm going to take care to not catch the corner. Let's do one more set. Tiny stitch up here. Don't stab my fingers. Tiny stitch down here. Okay, and now, can't see it very well on here, but I have these 3 loose sort of zigzags. So I'm going to very carefully pull that closed, and it rolls the hem over to create a really narrow hem. Oh, I'm free of the cat now. So again, let's continue on. Catch a few threads up here and down here, and I'm using my thumb on my left hand to continue rolling that really narrow little hem. Again, tiny stitch, tiny stitch. They shouldn't be too far off from each other, but they don't have to be super close. These might be a little closer than necessary. Rolled hem doesn't work as nicely with a heavier fabric, but with something light, like you might use for a scarf or a handkerchief, it works really nicely and creates a delicate little hem. So not too many stitches all at once. I'm going to pull very gently. So you'll see how it tightens here before it tightens here. I don't want too many stitches in between. If I need to even out my tension, I'll just drag my nail along there. And so we get this teeny tiny little rolled hem, but I do want to be really careful about that nail dragging because it can start to fray the fabric. So better off to just not have tension problems. I'm using a nice sharp needle. This might actually be a beading needle this time, so that I can take these tiny stitches. When I have to do sewing techniques, like these ones, I prefer to use a sharp needle. When I'm doing more embroidery techniques, I like to use a blunt embroidery or crewel needle. So I'm going to anchor here. There we are. And keep going. So this technique isn't especially quick, but it's not so slow as you might think. And is one of those techniques that it's really nice and portable. So like with a lot of hand stitching, you can take it with you, particularly in normal times when we do things like a commute on public transit. One of my friends from my embroiderers guild used to hand sew her clothes, and she'd do a rolled hem on her silk skirts while she was on the train going to and from work in Toronto. So again, keeping that nice tidy little rolled hem. This is maybe a teeny bit smaller than necessary, but you know, go tiny or go home. Like Miss with the tiny meow. All right, so I think I'm done with kitty interference for now. Sorry about that. So if I'm going to turn my hem with a little corner, also I'd want to trim the edges here. And I would go to the end and then again over. But if I'm doing a scarf or a veil, I might not want a sharp corner, in which case I might want to roll the corner, or I can trim it to a bit of an oblique angle, so that I end up with less of a sharp edge. I've been doing a very, very narrow little hem here, so I may have some difficulty on that. There we are. And I find sometimes it's easier just to pre-roll my corners so that they end up just that little bit tidier and closer. And then that can also mean I'm not fussing my tension around a corner. So here's where I'd want to trim that edge nice and close and then roll again going the other direction. Bring this down a little closer. So roll again, going the other direction, maybe take a couple of back stitches here so that as I'm pulling, I don't go around the corner and pull on any of the tension that I've already set. And then on the front side of this, the nice side, I should only see those teeny tiny little stitches that took up one thread or two on the ground fabric, to give me a nice rolled hem, which works well for handkerchiefs and scarves and veils, and also if you're using sheer fabrics on blouses or skirts, will give a nice finished edge that's quite light. If you're working with something that has a bit more structure, then you could even slide a thin wire in there in your rolled hem, so that you can structure it, bend it, and it'll hold its shape for things like a wired veil or a hat even, or if you're working in miniature. All right. Thank you, friends. Happy stitching.